the second week of May in 1979. I remember this week well. I went to my very last day of seminary that week. And I went to my last day of classes, I think it was a Wednesday, with a certain amount of fear and trepidation. I had no exams, but I had papers to fill, and that didn't create any fear or trepidation. I just didn't know what was going to happen next. What I did know is I was serving in a student appointment. I needed to move out because in early to mid-June, somebody else was moving in. So I was going to have to vacate the house, and I had yet to hear from the bishop and cabinet where they were going to appoint me. My friends had, I think every one of my friends had heard, both in northern New Jersey, which was our conference, and in other conferences. Everybody else knew they were going, and I had no idea what was going to happen to me. And around 1 o'clock, right before my early afternoon class, I went downstairs, and there in my mailbox, there was this little pink slip of paper. These were the days before cell phones. These were the days, some of you may remember a payphone. I had to use that. And it said, call your district superintendent immediately. I figured this was it. It had been 7 years since I graduated from high school. 7 years of preparation. And now I was going to be appointed to my own church. I was in a parish and I was sharing it. This was going to be just mine. And I knew exactly what it was going to look like. It was white. It had a steeple, it had red doors. All Methodist churches were white, had steeples and red doors, or so I thought. I just didn't quite know where it was going to be. And I made the call with great excitement and anticipation. And yes, I received news about my appointment, but it wasn't quite what I expected. It wasn't the church was a different color. It wasn't a church. The cabinet had discerned that they wanted me to become first full-time director of camps and conferences for northern New Jersey. And to be honest, wasn't quite sure how to take that news. I was so focused on serving in a local church and doing local church work, and now I was being asked to serve in this extension ministry. They wouldn't even guarantee that they would lead to ordination. I didn't quite know what to do. Well, when all else fails, you go to class and go to your last classes and finish up the day. And I went home, shared this news with Ellen, and we decided we just needed to talk about this. And if we talked at home, the phone would probably ring. So we bundled up Sarah, put her in a car seat. She was less than 6 months old at the time, and went for a ride because no one would disturb us in the car. And we rode for 2.5 hours and talked. And finally decided, well, I'll give it a try. What more can I do? I mean, we had kind of joked that we might have to go live in a tent. I didn't know that the cabinet was going to take me seriously on that. And it wasn't that it was an easy journey. I hadn't been trained or prepared for a lot of what I was going to face. But years later, I look back and say, what a blessing that time was. There were things I learned there that I never would have learned in a local church. I never learned how to cook for 100 people and not flip out about it. It's no big deal. I would never have learned how to manage a budget that was, at that time, it was as large as the largest church in our conference was what our camp budget was. I never would have learned how to supervise staff. And that was kind of baptism by fire. because within 2.5 weeks when the summer staff came in, I was supervising 35 people and never learned anything about that. And there were a lot of things that weren't so practical that I learned, but just helped me to embody what it was to serve God in a different way. Now, this was not to say that it was easy. There were times, within particularly the first 2 years, that I just wanted to pack it in and say, I can't do this anymore. Actually, my second summer, which I thought I had done all this work the first year, you do all that work, you think you got it all together, and then everything doesn't go perfectly. Because, we had to have people come to camp. That's how you do camp. You have to have people there. And they didn't do everything I expected. And I remember one day I was so angry, upset, frustrated, and I picked up the phone to call my supervisor. I was going to quit. I said, my supervisor was on vacation. So then I said, well, I'll call the district superintendent. The district superintendent was on vacation. Well, I'll call the covering superintendent. The covering superintendent was going to be out for a day or two. So I wanted to quit, and there was no one to quit to. Isn't that just the way things happen sometimes? But it became an experience that really became a blessing for me. But I wouldn't have known it at the time. Perhaps at that time, I think that is when in searching the scriptures and doing different things, I read again this passage from Romans. Paul wrote, it said, we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Now look at that carefully. It does not say that all things are good. Trust me. All things are not good. Some things are not very good at all and are very difficult and painful. But God can work good out of just about anything. Good things can come even when life brings us challenges. All of us at one point or another have some kind of life experience that's very difficult or painful, something we would rather not face if we didn't have to. Let's face it. Think of life situations with death of loved ones. We have divorce, loss of a job, required job relocations, major illnesses, accidents, unanticipated death, family illnesses, just to name a few. Yet we've lived through those times. And only later can we look back and say that we received something. That a gift emerged. That we were strengthened in some way that we never would have realized had we not gone through that. I think that's part of what was happening in Joseph's experience. Joseph, the favorite son of Jacob. We've been talking about Jacob the last couple weeks. And you would think that Jacob would have learned of all the conflict and stuff about having being a favored son of his mother and his brother being the favored son of his father. That doesn't go all that well. Having a favorite wife, all that you'd think he would have learned. No such luck. He had a favorite son, and that was Joseph. Joseph was the oldest of 2 children by his wife Rachel, his favorite wife, the one he loved. His younger brother Benjamin was born, and his mother died immediately following in Bethlehem. And the story of Joseph is really a rich story of a family feud. Joseph, though he was not the oldest, knew he was the favorite. He also had this gift of interpreting dreams. Now, there's some parts of Joseph you might say he wasn't too bright. Because he kind of let his brothers know that, well, I'm the favorite and you're not. and in my dreams I see you're going to bow down to me. And you're going to serve me. Well, this doesn't go too well with the other 11 brothers. You can imagine. They didn't like it, the fact that Joseph got this special coat from his brother. You may have heard it as his amazing Technicolor dream coat. That actually is a mistranslation in the King James Version. They came across words they didn't quite know, what made this coat so special. They decided it was a coat of many colors. It actually was a coat with sleeves. And that's what made it special. Now, I don't pretend to know how to sew. But I do know that it's very hard to put in a sleeve and to make it look right. I had an experience of that once. Not trying to put it in, but having one torn out that I could never get back in. Ruined a great shirt. And his brothers, the way they reacted was they threw him in a pit. They told his father that he had been killed. They watched, and this band of Ishmaelites came by, and they sold him to them, and he went to Egypt, and he was basically sold into slavery in the Pharaoh's household. Not a very good story. But from the midst of that, Joseph's gift of interpreting dreams helped out. He told Pharaoh, interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, and said to him, we're about to have 7 years of famine. But before that, we're going to have 7 good years. So let's grow all the crops we can. We'll build storehouses. We'll store the grain away so that when the famine comes, we'll be in good shape. And that's exactly what they did. And the famine did come, even in the land of Canaan, where his 11 brothers and sister Dinah, where they lived. And he brought them. And they came down to Joseph. And they were begging for food. They didn't know Joseph was there. They had no idea. And the scripture this morning tells of their reunion. And there's something that Joseph says. You would think that they might be groveling. They might be so upset. Oh no, it's Joseph. He's never going to help us. What can we do? But Joseph says something. He says, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. God sent me for a good purpose. It wasn't that the things that happened to him were good, but God sent him for a purpose. And God would use that and the journey to bless others. I think in that moment there was more than a reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers. There was a reconciliation of Joseph and himself. Joseph had been rather self-serving through most of his journey. And now he realized that God was using him to serve others. That was really the essence of who he was as we continue to read the story. Sometimes, in the midst of this struggle, we just have to be reconciled to ourselves. Accept that God has blessed us and given us good gifts. I've been blessed over the years to know countless numbers of people who have been wounded in life and yet go on to transform that experience into one that not just gets themselves out of trouble, but they bless others with that. I have known and been encouraged by people who have utilized some of their most challenging, life-changing experiences to make a significant difference for other people. Persons in recovery from addictions who support and lead others who are seeking sobriety. Women who have lived in abusive situations, who have gotten out of that and have helped other women find the strength to do what was needed so that they could find wholeness in their lives. People who have experienced debilitating illnesses and conditions, and they've turned around and refused to be defined by those by those circumstances and help others to find wholeness in their lives. Make no mistake. These painful things, I don't believe, are all part of God's plan. I don't get that theology, to be quite honest. You know, in the midst of it, well, God has a plan. I'm sure this happened for a reason, because God made this happen. That's kind of cruel and sadistic when you think about it. Rather, I look to what Jesus said, the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, "Is there anyone among you who, if your child asks for bread, will give a stone? Or if a child asks for a fish, will give a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him?" How much more will God give us? This is who God is. God who is able to take whatever happens in our lives, any of the challenges, any of those things that can seem to be tearing us down, and will help us to find a way to use that experience so that we can bless others. It's God's desire that we be reconciled. It's God's desire that we find wholeness in life. It's God's desire that that brings us peace and that we can then share that experience with someone else and take those experiences so that the world can be blessed around us. This is what God intends. This is actually what we see when we see this very churchy word, salvation. It's a loaded word in this day and age. But what does salvation really mean? Well, if you look at the root of it, we get this word, a salve. What's that? It's a healing ointment. Something that brings about healing and wholeness. That's what God desires. Not just for ourselves, but in our relationships, in our world, and in our relationship with God. Joseph, through his long experience, came to realize that he was a whole person as he helped someone else and journeyed with them. As he was able to come back together and say, don't worry about this. God sent me, in here, God sent something so that we can not only come back together, but that there can be life beyond us. I recently read a story, not a full biography, but a story of a young man. He grew up in a household of an abusive father who was an alcoholic. He was sent to public school, and he was at best a mediocre student. And people who knew him then said he wouldn't really lead to much. He had debilitating shyness, which meant he had a very hard time relating to other people. And especially, he met a young woman, and he was in his early 20s. And this got in the way of forming what could have been a wonderful relationship with the one woman in his life that he ever wrote anything about and he really loved. He suffered from terrible stomach illness as early as his 20s, and by his mid-20s he started to go deaf, both of which were really difficult to be able to function in the world. Here was somebody who should not have made it. You might recognize his picture. It's Beethoven. Ludwig van Beethoven had what we might all consider to be a terrible life. But in 1824, just 3 years before his death, he composed his final symphony, which many consider to be one of the greatest ever written. And it is a joyous celebration of humanity. God was with him in the journey. And the journey led him to a place that he could share not only his joy, but he could share joy so that others might celebrate. If God could do it with Beethoven, God can do it with us as well.